The UK has just been blindsided. A devastating blow has landed squarely on British industry, and it's not just any economic hiccup, it's a direct attack, a brutal financial punishment orchestrated by none other than Donald Trump. A 25% tariff on British steel and aluminium has sent shockwaves through the economy, triggering a full-blown crisis. Businesses are scrambling, jobs are on the line, and Keir Starmer is now facing the most formidable challenge of his premiership. But here's the real shocker: this isn't just about trade. This is personal. And according to Trump, the blame lies squarely with Starmer himself. Let's not sugarcoat it. This is economic warfare. Trump has wielded tariffs as weapons before, using them to strong-arm foreign governments into submission. But why is he targeting the UK now? The answer is as alarming as it is revealing. Trump, a self-proclaimed champion of free speech, is furious over the UK's recent clampdown on protests and political dissent. He sees Starmer's government as yet another weak, globalist regime that silences its own citizens, and has decided to make Britain pay the price. The timing couldn't be worse. Just weeks ago, Starmer was in Washington, grinning for the cameras, shaking hands with American officials, and desperately trying to secure a strong post-Brexit trade relationship. He even extended an invitation to Trump, a move that now seems laughable in hindsight. Because instead of securing new deals, instead of fortifying Britain's economic future, Starmer returned empty-handed. And now, his so-called special relationship with the US is in tatters. The financial impact is already catastrophic. The steel and aluminium industries are reeling, with major companies warning of factory closures and mass layoffs. Trade unions are sounding the alarm, and industry leaders are describing the tariffs as an existential threat. For years, British steelmakers have relied on exports to the US. Now, that market is slipping through their fingers. And what is Downing Street doing about it? Next to nothing. While the European Union has already announced retaliatory measures, Starmer's government is stuck in so-called behind-the-scenes negotiations, insisting that a diplomatic resolution is the best course of action. But let's be brutally honest. Does anyone really believe that quiet diplomacy will make Trump back down? This is the same man who revels in economic strong-arming, the same leader who imposed tariffs on allies without blinking an eye. And yet, Starmer's response so far has been timid, hesitant, dare we say, weak. The frustration is boiling over. Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds has called the tariffs deeply disappointing, but refuses to confirm whether the UK will fight back. The opposition is in uproar, with conservative politicians openly lambasting Starmer's lack of backbone. Shadow Chancellor Jeremy Hunt has gone on the offensive, calling for immediate, forceful retaliation. But here's the real question: does Starmer even have the courage to fight back? Because let's be clear, Trump's move isn't just an economic policy decision. It's a calculated show of strength. He's sending a message: if you cross me, there will be consequences. And right now, it looks like Starmer is simply rolling over, letting British industry suffer under Trump's punishing economic grip. Behind closed doors, the panic is setting in. Starmer has reportedly made frantic attempts to appeal to Trump directly, pleading for an exemption. According to sources, he even tried to remind Trump of the long-standing UK-US alliance, stressing the economic fallout these tariffs would cause. But Trump, he wasn't having any of it. Cold, calculating, and utterly unmoved, Trump made it clear that his priority is America, not Britain. In fact, insiders claim Trump went even further. In a private phone call, he dismissed Starmer outright, reportedly telling him that the UK had brought this on itself. And yet, Downing Street continues to insist that negotiations are ongoing. But negotiations with who? Because Trump clearly isn't budging. And let's compare this to past UK leaders who actually had the guts to stand up to Washington. When Boris Johnson faced similar tariffs during Trump's first administration, his government retaliated, aggressively. They threatened countermeasures, pushed for immediate negotiations, and fought tooth and nail for British industry. And the result? Partial tariff reversals. Contrast that with Starmer's approach: quiet diplomacy, endless discussions, and, so far, absolutely no results. This is a disaster, both economically and politically. Starmer's inability to stand up for British businesses is not going unnoticed. Industry leaders are losing patience. The steel sector, already battling soaring energy costs and global competition, is now at a breaking point. Gareth Stace, Director General of UK Steel, has slammed the government's inaction as utterly unacceptable. He warns that thousands of jobs are now at risk and that if decisive action isn't taken, entire communities could be wiped out. And this goes beyond industry. This is now a full-scale political crisis. The opposition is having a field day, accusing Starmer of dithering while the UK economy burns. Even within his own party, murmurs of discontent are growing louder. Some Labour MPs are openly questioning whether Starmer's refusal to challenge Trump will alienate working-class voters, the very people who backed Labour in the last election, believing they would protect British jobs. And here's the kicker: Trump isn't done. His administration is already hinting that the next round of tariffs could hit British pharmaceuticals. Imagine the consequences. The UK's pharmaceutical sector, one of its most vital industries, could be next on the chopping block. If Trump decides to cut off UK access to the American market, it would be nothing short of an economic catastrophe. So what now? The pressure is unbearable, and Starmer is running out of options. If he retaliates with his own tariffs, he risks triggering a full-blown trade war, a fight Britain is woefully unequipped to win. But if he does nothing, he will be seen as weak. And that, politically, is the kiss of death. Inside Westminster, the divisions are growing. Some ministers are urging Starmer to take a hardline stance, pushing for immediate countermeasures. The idea of slapping tariffs on American goods, bourbon, jeans, motorcycles, is gaining traction. But economic advisors are warning that such a move could backfire, leading Trump to escalate even further. And let's not forget, Trump has the power to go nuclear, banning UK tech firms from American markets, restricting intelligence sharing, even freezing financial access to Wall Street. And what about the European Union? EU leaders are watching this crisis unfold with mixed emotions. Some are sympathetic. Others see an opportunity. Whispers are circulating in Brussels. Should the UK realign with the EU on trade policies? Could this crisis push Britain back towards the single market? It's an explosive idea, but some desperate members of Starmer's team are beginning to entertain it. And then, just when it seems things couldn't get worse, Trump drops the ultimate bombshell. In a fiery campaign speech, he warns that unless Britain changes its policies, he's prepared to completely cut off the UK from future US trade agreements. This is it. The moment of truth. Starmer now faces the defining choice of his leadership. Does he stand up to Trump, risking a devastating economic war? Or does he cave, giving Trump exactly what he wants and shattering his own credibility? The stakes couldn't be higher. The pressure is relentless. And the world is watching. The silence from Downing Street is deafening. As the UK's steel and aluminium industries teeter on the edge of collapse, Keir Starmer's government remains paralysed, trapped in a cycle of endless discussions and hollow reassurances. Meanwhile, the European Union has already announced retaliatory measures against Donald Trump's aggressive tariffs, sending a clear signal that it won't be pushed around. But Britain dithers. Officials insist they are working behind the scenes to secure exemptions, but let's call it what it is: stalling. This isn't diplomacy, it's political cowardice. And the frustration is boiling over. Business leaders are sounding the alarm, unions are furious, and opposition politicians are calling for immediate action. Yet, when pressed on whether Britain will impose its own tariffs on American goods, Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds can only muster a meek deeply disappointing regarding Trump's actions. That's the best we get? Deeply disappointing. The livelihoods of thousands are on the line, industries are bracing for devastation, and this government's response is to express disappointment? Jeremy Hunt doesn't buy it, and neither does anyone paying attention. The Shadow Chancellor is calling for an immediate and forceful response, branding Starmer's approach weak and ineffective. And he's not alone. Across the political spectrum, there is growing unease over the Prime Minister's inability, or unwillingness, to fight back. This isn't just about economic policy anymore. It's about credibility. It's about leadership. And right now, Starmer is failing on both fronts. But let's not pretend this is just about steel and aluminium. Because it isn't. This is a power play, a calculated act of economic retaliation, and the real reason behind Trump's move is far more sinister. Many believe these tariffs are a direct response to Starmer's domestic policies, specifically his increasing crackdown on free speech and public protest. Trump, never one to shy away from a political fight, sees Starmer as just another weak European leader caving to the forces of censorship and state overreach. And if there's one thing Trump despises, it's governments that muzzle dissent. He's sending a message, loud and clear. If Britain wants to trample on liberties, if it wants to silence opposition voices under the guise of public order and misinformation laws, then it will pay the price. Trump isn't just hitting Britain where it hurts economically, he's exposing Starmer as incapable of defending his own country from foreign aggression. And now, the UK finds itself at a crossroads. The government is running out of time. Businesses are demanding answers. The markets are already reacting. Sterling has taken a hit, investor confidence is wavering, and financial analysts are warning that this crisis could spiral into something much worse if immediate action isn't taken. Yet Starmer, ever the cautious politician, continues to believe he can negotiate with Trump. Negotiate? With Trump? Has he learned nothing? Trump is not a politician who respects quiet diplomacy. He respects strength. He respects leaders who push back, who fight for their country. And right now, Starmer is showing none of that. Instead of a decisive plan to counter Trump's tariffs, we get vague statements about exploring options. Instead of taking a stand, we get whispers of ongoing discussions. It's the same feeble, defensive approach that has plagued this government from the start. And while Britain hesitates, the damage is already happening. Steelworkers who have dedicated their lives to the industry are now staring down the prospect of unemployment. Manufacturing plants, already struggling with post-Brexit supply chain chaos and rising energy costs, are considering relocating operations outside the UK. The automotive sector, heavily reliant on American exports, is bracing for a major downturn. And it's not just big business feeling the squeeze. Small and medium-sized enterprises, the backbone of Britain's economy, are now in survival mode. The economic hit is undeniable, but the political ramifications are just as severe. Starmer has spent years trying to position himself as a steady hand, a competent alternative to the chaos of previous administrations. But what good is steadiness if it means inaction? What good is competence if it means capitulation? The perception of weakness is taking root, and once that happens, it is nearly impossible to shake. And make no mistake, Trump isn't done. There are already murmurs from Washington that the next wave of tariffs could target British pharmaceuticals, one of the most crucial sectors of the UK economy. Imagine the devastation if UK drug manufacturers were suddenly cut off from American markets. Imagine the thousands of jobs that would disappear overnight. The UK is being cornered, and Trump is watching to see if Starmer will finally stand up and fight, or if he will continue to beg for mercy behind closed doors. And what of the European Union? EU leaders are watching Britain's weak response with a mix of concern and opportunity. While some are expressing solidarity, others are quietly wondering if this crisis could be used to pull Britain back toward European alignment. Whispers in Brussels suggest that some officials are even encouraging the UK to reconsider aspects of the single market as a means of economic protection. Could this crisis be the final push that forces Britain back under the EU's economic umbrella? If so, it would be an admission of total failure for Starmer, a leader who promised that Brexit was done and that Britain would stand on its own. So, what's the move? Does Starmer finally retaliate, risking further escalation? Does he impose tariffs of his own, knowing full well that Britain is in a far weaker position than the US? Or does he continue down this road of passive diplomacy, hoping against all odds that Trump has a sudden change of heart? The stakes could not be higher. If Starmer acts too aggressively, he risks plunging the UK into an all-out trade war with the most powerful economy in the world. If he does nothing, he cements his reputation as a leader who let his country be walked over without a fight. And as the pressure mounts, the cracks within Starmer's own party are beginning to show. Labour MPs are growing restless. Some worry that if the Prime Minister does not take decisive action, it will be seen as a betrayal of the working class, those very communities that Labour promised to protect. If Starmer loses their trust, the political consequences could be catastrophic. Meanwhile, Trump continues to tighten the screws. He knows exactly what he's doing. He is playing Starmer like a chess piece, and so far, the Prime Minister has fallen into every single trap. While Starmer flounders, Trump stands before his supporters and delivers a clear, unflinching message: the days of America being taken advantage of are over. And to his base, this is exactly what they wanted to hear. For the UK, the nightmare is only just beginning. And for Starmer, the choice is stark: fight back, or be remembered as the Prime Minister who let Britain be humiliated on the world stage. Keir Starmer is running out of road. The economic storm triggered by Donald Trump's brutal tariffs is gaining momentum, and Downing Street is utterly paralyzed. Every attempt to negotiate, to reason, to plead with Washington has been met with a cold and calculated silence. Trump is playing hardball, and the Prime Minister is woefully out of his depth. According to sources within Westminster, Starmer has spent the past few weeks desperately trying to get Trump to reconsider, to soften the devastating 25% tariff that is strangling the UK's steel and aluminium industries. But here's the reality: Trump doesn't back down, and he certainly doesn't hand out favors to leaders he considers weak. Reports suggest that in a tense private phone call, Starmer attempted to invoke history, reminding Trump of the so-called special relationship between Britain and the United States. He spoke of economic fallout, of the shared interests between both nations, of Britain's unwavering support for the US on the global stage. But Trump, he wasn't interested. He doesn't deal in sentiment. He deals in power. Insiders say the former US president dismissed Starmer outright, reportedly telling him that the UK had brought this on itself. Trump, ever the master of economic leverage, made it clear that Britain was no longer a priority, that Starmer's government had alienated him, and that the UK would have to deal with the consequences of its own policies. The tone was sharp, dismissive, Trump's message unmistakable: America first, Britain last. And yet, Downing Street continues to peddle the fantasy that negotiations are ongoing. Negotiations with whom? Because Trump clearly isn't listening. The longer Starmer clings to this illusion of diplomacy, the worse the situation becomes. There is no deal. There is no breakthrough on the horizon. While British businesses suffer, Starmer continues to fumble in the dark, still believing that appeasement will somehow bring Trump to the table. The contrast with previous leadership could not be more damning. When Boris Johnson faced Trump's tariffs during his first administration, his government fought back, aggressively. Johnson's team immediately threatened retaliatory measures, pushing for emergency negotiations and using every diplomatic and economic tool at their disposal. It was controversial, it was confrontational, but it got results. Some tariffs were lifted, and Britain was, at the very least, seen as standing its ground. Now, Starmer's government is adopting the opposite approach: cautious, hesitant, and ultimately ineffective. The result? A free fall in British industry. The steel sector, already battered by high energy costs and global competition, is now staring into the abyss. Major manufacturers are warning that they will be forced to shut down entire factories, leading to thousands of job losses. UK Steel Director Gareth Stace has publicly condemned the government's inaction, calling it utterly unacceptable. The message from industry leaders is unanimous: unless Starmer acts fast, British manufacturing will be devastated. And it's not just the business sector that's turning against him. Public perception is beginning to shift dramatically. Starmer, who spent years positioning himself as a pragmatic, competent alternative to conservative chaos, is now looking like a leader paralyzed by indecision. The cracks within his own party are growing wider. Labour MPs, particularly those representing working-class, industrial regions, are growing restless. These are the voters who trusted Labour to protect their livelihoods, to safeguard British jobs. And yet, all they see now is a Prime Minister who can't even stand up to a foreign leader hell-bent on crippling their industries. The warning signs are flashing. If Starmer does not act decisively, if he allows this crisis to fester, he risks not just economic ruin, but political disaster. His party's support in key industrial areas, the very backbone of Labour's electoral success, could crumble overnight. And once that trust is lost, it is almost impossible to rebuild. But here's the real nightmare: Trump is just getting started. There are already murmurs that his administration is preparing another economic blow, this time targeting British pharmaceuticals. Imagine the consequences. The UK's pharmaceutical industry, a cornerstone of its economy, could be next in the firing line. If Trump cuts off British access to the American market, the fallout will be catastrophic. We are talking about billions in lost revenue, thousands of high-skilled jobs evaporating, and yet another sector being pushed to the brink. And still, Downing Street dithers. So what now? The options are bleak. Starmer could retaliate with his own tariffs on American goods, hitting bourbon, jeans, motorcycles, products that would sting US industries. But such a move would risk escalating the crisis into a full-scale trade war, a battle Britain is woefully unprepared to win. On the other hand, if he continues to do nothing, if he clings to the fantasy of quiet diplomacy, he will be seen as weak, ineffective, and incapable of defending British interests. Inside Westminster, the pressure is mounting. Some within Labour are beginning to openly question Starmer's leadership. Rumours of dissent are growing. If he cannot protect British jobs, if he allows Trump to walk all over Britain without consequence, then what good is his leadership at all? And then, the unthinkable. New reports out of Washington suggest that Trump is considering an even more drastic step, cutting off British financial institutions from US markets. This is no longer just about steel. This is economic warfare. The City of London, the heart of Britain's financial sector, relies on seamless access to American markets. If Trump pulls the plug, the consequences will be nothing short of catastrophic. The pound will plummet. Stock markets will spiral into chaos. Investors will flee. We are looking at the potential for a full-scale economic meltdown. This is the moment of truth. If Starmer fails to act, if he allows Britain to be humiliated on the world stage, he may as well hand over the keys to number 10. Because this crisis is not just about economics, it is about credibility. It is about sovereignty. It is about whether Britain has a leader who is willing to fight for it, or one who will let it be trampled underfoot. And right now, the world is watching. Trump has made his move. The question is, will Starmer finally fight back, or will he fold, proving once and for all that he is not up to the job? The crisis has reached a boiling point. Donald Trump is tightening his grip, and the UK is teetering on the edge of economic disaster. The tariffs on British steel and aluminium were just the beginning. Now, Trump is threatening to escalate further, targeting the UK's pharmaceutical industry, one of its most crucial economic sectors. If this happens, Britain's ability to sell life-saving medicines and cutting-edge medical technology to the US will be crippled overnight. Billions in revenue, thousands of jobs, and years of investment in British research and development would be wiped out in a single stroke. And yet, Downing Street still seems paralyzed, unable, or unwilling, to mount a meaningful response. Then comes the final blow. In a dramatic press conference, Trump delivers his most ruthless threat yet. Unless the UK submits to his demands, British financial institutions will be locked out of the US markets. This isn't just a trade dispute anymore. This is economic warfare. The City of London, the beating heart of Britain's financial power, is now in the crosshairs. If Trump follows through, major UK banks could find themselves frozen out of Wall Street, unable to access crucial American capital. The pound nosedives. Markets spiral. Investors scramble to shield themselves from the fallout. And what is the government doing? Starmer and his ministers are stuck in a brutal internal battle. Some argue that Britain must concede, that it cannot afford to go to war with the most powerful economy in the world. They warn that if Trump carries out his threats, the UK could plunge into a financial crisis deeper than anything seen in modern history. Others, however, believe that caving to Washington would be a national humiliation, a surrender that would make Britain look like a powerless pawn on the world stage. Then, finally, Starmer moves. In a high-stakes televised address, the Prime Minister announces that the UK will not bow to American intimidation. He refuses to meet Trump's demands and, in a shocking turn, unveils retaliatory tariffs on US goods. British sanctions will now hit American exports, including whiskey, textiles, and motor vehicles, sending a clear message that the UK is willing to fight back. The reaction is instant. Across Britain, a wave of nationalist defiance erupts. Some hail Starmer's decision as a long-overdue stand against American economic bullying. He is suddenly painted as a leader who refused to let Britain be pushed around, a man who finally defended his country's sovereignty. But not everyone is convinced. Business leaders are panicked, warning that retaliation could provoke even harsher countermeasures from Washington. The opposition seizes on the chaos. Conservative figures accuse Starmer of recklessness, of gambling with the country's economic future in a war Britain simply cannot win. Meanwhile, in the US, Trump is furious. He goes on the offensive, promising an even more devastating response. American businesses with ties to the UK begin reassessing their operations, some pulling out of British markets entirely. Washington insiders speculate about further restrictions, with some suggesting that Trump could go even further, perhaps even freezing British assets in the US or imposing crippling tariffs on British automotive and aerospace exports. Yet, in a surprising twist, Trump's aggression begins to backfire. Major US corporations, pharmaceutical giants, financial institutions, and manufacturers who rely on British imports start pushing back against the White House. They warn that if the trade war escalates, the American economy could also suffer. Lobbyists flood Washington, applying pressure on Trump to rethink his strategy. Wall Street investors begin voicing concerns, and some Republican lawmakers, previously staunch allies of Trump, suggest that the tariffs could have unintended consequences for American businesses. Could it be that Starmer's defiance is forcing a shift? Could the pressure from within the US itself force Trump to reconsider? The cracks in Trump's strategy are beginning to show. But here's the brutal reality: this isn't over. Far from it. The UK's economy remains in turmoil, with businesses unsure whether to brace for long-term conflict or hope for a last-minute truce. Political tensions in Westminster are at an all-time high, with Starmer's leadership now under the microscope. His supporters insist that he made the right choice, that Britain cannot afford to be seen as weak. His critics, however, argue that he has plunged the country into unnecessary economic peril, that his handling of the crisis has been a reckless display of brinkmanship. The world is watching. The stakes have never been higher. Trump has made his move, and Starmer has finally fought back. But the question remains: who will blink first?